I imagine many of you are still wondering why you're being asked to read about a British journalist whose most significant work was performed in the last century. And what I'm going to do is explain why you're being asked to do the reading about Kate Adie this week and how we can take lessons from her story and apply them to other figures, other journalists, but also other industries as well. So, just a little bit about Kate Adie first. Kate Adie, when the history of journalism is written, certainly the history of British journalism at least, Kate Adie will certainly features prominently in that story. There are several reasons why we should talk about her. One is that a lot of authors have written about her. And the reading from this week is one example of that. But she's been a real key figure around which questions of gender and sexism in journalism have been discussed. But also, one of the reasons why we're talking about her, a couple of things. Firstly, she's a really interesting person who, like Emma Alberici, became the center of all kinds of political controversies because of the way that she did her work. And the story is quite an unlikely one. She has a really compelling backstory that's significant to the way that she did her work. So, Kate Adie, and on the picture on the left here, we have Kate Adie when she began work as a news trainee in the 1960s. And on the right is one of the moments where she really made her name, which was as a TV news correspondent during the first Iraq War in 1991, where she received extensive praise for the work that she did embedded with British troops during that war. But her rise to success is pretty unlikely in many ways. Kate Adie is an orphan. She is what we sort of quaintly called a foundling. She was found as a baby. Her birth parents had left her on the steps of a church, and she was adopted by a foster family and a working class family in the north of England, and got into university, which is pretty remarkable, a pretty remarkable achievement for a working class English woman in the 1960s. Comes out of that, goes on to become a news trainee, really makes her mark as a news journalist in the 1980s. And where she makes her mark is she's one of the only Western journalists to cover the 1987 US bombing of Tripoli, which is the capital of Libya, from within the country. And she came under extensive political pressure for that particular story. What happened was American bombers launched an airstrike against the regime of Colonel Gaddafi, the Libyan leader at the time, launched those airstrikes from British air bases. And Kate Adie went to Tripoli itself and reported on the devastation of the airstrikes, and particularly focused in on the civilian deaths and the number of orphans which the airstrikes had caused. And she received extensive criticisms from the British government of the day, the government of Margaret Thatcher. Her reporting was seen as being un-British. But we know why she did the reporting in the way that she did, because when Kate Adie retired, she left an archive of all of the notes that she'd taken in her career as a journalist and left them at the University of Sunderland, and they are there for any researcher who wants to read them to have a look at. And so she has notes from her time in Libya. And what she notes down is the fact that she was very used to working alongside male journalists who, whenever they went into a war zone, the first thing they would do was search out army officers and government officials and get their version of what was happening on the ground. And when she went to Libya, it's a very moving example. She says, "Well, as someone who is a foundling, who is an orphan, whenever she's in a war zones always create orphans, and we never hear from them. We see them on the camera, but we never hear from them. We never see the world with the war from their point of view." And she kind of couldn't help but see the world from their point of view and wanted to tell their story. And as a result, the story that she told about the US bombing of Libya in 1987 was really quite different. And from the story that was being told by her other colleagues. So Kate Adie was very clear in her work that she did come to war journalism. She makes her mark as a war journalist, but she comes from that from a very different perspective, which is related to her childhood, but also related to her gender. In Tim Markham's work, he refers to the way that Kate Adie was, in her work as a war journalist, was subjected to all kinds of pretty outrageous sexist judgments. So, for example, when she went to Iraq and worked alongside British troops, she was widely criticised for being too flirtatious with British troops, and this was seen as being hugely inappropriate. Aside from anything else, because at that stage she was a middle-aged woman, and it wasn't deemed to be an appropriate thing for a middle-aged woman to have the appearance of flirting with British soldiers who were mostly male and mostly a bit younger than she was. And Markham makes the point that the same sorts of judgments weren't made at all about male journalists who, in some cases, struck up relationships with much younger women who they were reporting upon. And so he talks about this real kind of double standard regarding with gender that really had a significant influence on Kate Adie's career. She had to constantly combat the charges that she only got to tell the stories that she did because she was willing to flirt with soldiers or whatever you have. So you have a woman who uses her background to create a perspective that forges a remarkable career as a journalist, but that career is something which is constantly fraught by structural barriers, by the existence of sexism in the journalism profession, but also the constant way in which journalists are subjected to pretty severe political critiques. And it's actually kind of interesting that it's said that Margaret Thatcher wanted, Kate Adie was working for the BBC at this time, and Margaret Thatcher wanted the BBC to fire Kate Adie, but unlike Emma Alberici, she could never really put that much pressure on because Kate Adie was enormously popular with British audiences. So I suppose the Conservative regime at the time, so the story goes, calculated that they would lose far more in public favour by applying pressure to Kate Adie than they would win in having her removed. So why study Kate Adie? Well, one of the reasons is that we should certainly study Kate Adie because of as a particular example of reporting excellence in war journalism, an example of how to do things imaginatively and differently in a way that really connects with the public. But the other reason is rather more prosaic, and this is something that I want you to apply to your work. We study Kate Adie because there's evidence that allows us to study her career about almost half a century as a journalist, and particularly the places where her job as a journalism encountered all kinds of structural issues, the pressure that national governments placed on public broadcasters. So Kate Adie, like Emma Alberici, is a representation of the kinds of clashes between media industries and other national governments, for example. She's also someone who allows us to talk about institutional sexism, a form of sexism, a form of gender bias, which is just ingrained into the practice of journalism, particularly war journalism, as a profession which one assumes is largely devoted to, is one which is largely largely pursued by men. Well, it was at that point. Obviously, we know today that's not the case. But how doing her job meant engaging with and finding ways to manage this sexism. And so, again, what we see is that Kate Adie is a figure like Emma Alberici, who we can use to access a broader set of wider questions about how journalism functions as a particular media profession in a certain context. So what this is really about is about thinking about what do we need to perform the method of researching media industries by looking at key informants. Who can we access who will tell us how media industries really work in regard to broader social issues? Who has that experience? Where can we find evidence that allows us to talk about these things in an interesting and engaging way?